Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Tipiso Makwetla. A quick reminder of the top stories this hour. Israel's parliament has passed a law barring Palestinian spouses. The citizenship law denies naturalization of Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza who are married to Israeli citizens. As Russia widens its war on Ukraine, people with disabilities are now caught in the conflict. Russia forces have blown up a disabled care home and hospitals as they march towards the capital, Kiev. Visual artist Kumzi Nyekdwana continuing to make strides in the sector. The Gqeberha-born artist has been chosen to represent South Africa at the International World of Nations exhibition in the United States. So to that story about the Israeli parliament passing a law denying naturalization to Palestinians from the occupied West Bank or Gaza married to Israeli citizens. The move has forced thousands of Palestinian families to either emigrate or live apart. The so-called citizenship law was passed on Thursday just before the Knesset. It was the last act of parliament before it disbanded for a holiday recess. The law was passed a 45-50 majority vote that crossed coalition opposition lines. It replaces a similar temporary order that first passed during the height of a Palestinian uprising in 2003. So the temporary order had continually been renewed annually until it expired in July last year. This was after the Knesset failed to secure a simple majority needed to extend it. Professor Farid Esak is with us from the University of Johannesburg. He's also a board member of Lobby Group Africa for Palestine. A very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So why do you think it found success, a majority success in the Knesset this time round?
Well, not that it is of much consequence, but actually just exactly a half of the 120-member Knesset participated in this vote. And in the vote, they got a 45-15 majority. So in theory, it's 45 out of 120 that have voted for this. But of course, in the Israeli parliamentary system, two things need to be borne in mind. The one is that the entire Knesset itself is not really Palestinian or religiously or ethnically diverse, really, although it has a smattering of Palestinians inside this parliament. Secondly, it's really of no consequence that it had only half of the members of the Knesset voted on it. This is part of an ongoing and growing tendency, painful, because one often thinks that racism and xenophobia can't get any worse than a particular moment. But the one thing that Israel consistently tells us that, yes, xenophobia, racism, the blanket rubbishing of an entire people, the Palestinians, it is not only routine, but it can actually be exacerbated and increased all the time.
So as you mentioned, the United Arab List or Ram Party through Mansour Abbas saying that they oppose the legislation. But what are people understanding about the motive behind it? Because those who are critical of it are saying that it's really to ensure that Israeli security maintains its Jewish character. What are your thoughts around this?
No, not only those who are opposed to it, but in fact all the parliamentarians who spoke in favor of it, they largely provided two reasons for it. The one is the question of what they call security, and the other question is to maintain the Jewish character of the state. Now, as for security, to rubbish and say that all Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank are necessarily a security threat to the state of Israel. That is something. And then on the other things is also that to retain the Jewish character of the state. And of course, in Israeli law, Jewish character, unlike what other people understand it, by virtue of, say, a religious identity, the Jewish character of the state is defined by one's ethnic origin. Mm-hmm. I mean, who were your parents? What is your blood or your genetic composition? And of course, we know that anything based on genetic composition, on bloodlines, it has to not only result from racism, but can only lead to a deeper racism. And so this, the fortification of the Jewish state, as they're saying, inevitably it must mean the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And this so-called citizenship law is just one further, arguably the most serious legislative weapon that has been introduced to further this ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Of course, it comes at a very convenient time when the media of the world either has chosen to or is compelled by its international networks to focus entirely on the war in the Ukraine. And so that is not, I mean, Israel is quite notorious actually for enacting these kinds of measures or missile bombings on some of the other occupied territories, say during Christmas or the New Year, and in this case, when the attention of the world is on something else. So this is standard Israeli fare in how they move in on the Palestinians. So it is a Knesset measure, yes. And it comes after, of course, as you pointed out, they've been having the same law, but on an ad hoc basis for nearly 20 years now. And of course, it has been renewed but this is just standard fare of the war against the Palestinians that painfully cannot succeed in getting the attention of most of the quote-unquote international media, which is really soft speak for the global north and the Western controlled media.
So just in the context of Palestinian statehood and the Middle East conflict, what will be the effect of this? Because, as you said, it's aimed at people of Palestinian heritage. Does it mean it effectively prevents the return of Palestinian refugees driven from their homes?
Well, it effectively lessens by far the amount of Palestinians that can possibly, in the immediate term, return to what is often described, and I have my issues with it, as Israel proper. Because given the cultural and the Christian and Muslim nature of Palestinian society, many of the Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the fact that people in Israel, that the Palestinians who live there, and they make up more than 20% of the Israeli population. So this is an attempt to not only deny the right of return for people outside, to further deny that right, but to actually ensure that the Palestinian population inside Israel is further diminished. And the corollary, of course, is this, that thousands of Jewish or people who claim to be Jews in the Ukraine, that Israel is preparing to take in thousands of them at the moment. So creating in some ways or entrenching the refugee status of Palestinians and denying Palestinian citizens inside Israel a very basic right, that if you get married to somebody from any nationality whatsoever, after a number of years of living in the country of your spouse, you are entitled to citizenship of that country. And this is a universal law in the vast majority of countries. But for Israel to now say, complete strangers from any other soil, as long as they are born with these genes, that they can now come and become citizens, quite frankly, immediately. And then the Palestinian citizens of that state, they're not allowed to marry or to bring their spouses in who are in in Gaza or in the West Bank. And so the ultimate result is this. I mean, people may decide, oh gosh, it's not worth it getting married, to a... So it's very difficult to a Palestinian in Gaza, so it's very difficult to foresee the consequences of this, except to say that it is certainly an escalation of the intensification of an ongoing, not just an apartheid state, but a state that is actively conniving in dispossessing the indigenous Palestinians of the vast majority of their rights.
I'm curious about something, just listening to you talk, Professor Esak. You mentioned the Ukraine context within this, and this law itself bars the unification of Israelis with people from Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. What Russia has been talking about ultra-right elements in Ukraine and the white supremacy nature of this. Are you saying that there could be resonance found in the motive here as well?
Well, I am not I'm not supportive of the Russian narrative around the Nazi element inside the Ukraine. But at the end of the day, what is very, very clear is that the world in general, and it's not just, I'm afraid, a media distortion, that the world in general, and by the world, we really talk about the powerful in the world, that they really are only interested in white people getting injured or white people being victims. And so there's this larger racial thing that is, and I dare say that in this narrative where white lives matter, and their implication is that only white lives matter. This is completely different from when black people say black lives matter. Black people never mean that only black lives matter. So in their narrative of white lives matter, there is this correlation between how the quote-unquote world is receiving the Ukraine and how the quote-unquote, and I'm saying this sarcastically, has dealt with other battles for rights in the world. So the Palestinians don't matter because they're not white in the sense that white racists would, and here I include the Zionist narrative in this white racist paradigm. So it is in this that that the powerful in the world, their response to Ukraine is in some ways, it's also what is seen in their response to the question of the occupation and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian lands and people. So it is there, I think, where the racism symmetry is very, very applicable.
Okay. Are there any prospects of success for opponents of this law to take it to Israel's Supreme Court? Okay,
so now the matter is going to the Supreme Court. And the court has, I mean, from time to time, it has moderated the right-wing impulses, or the more right-wing impulses of the Israeli government and political parties. But in recent years, the court has been moving closer and closer to the right. I mean, there is only so far that a court can go in any part of the world in actively dissenting from the vast majority of people in the country. And clearly, public opinion inside Israel, and I'm now talking about the white or the Jewish part of Israel, that and even when I say the white part of Israel, I don't want to get into semantics about the fact that there are also Ethiopians who are Israelis. So I think that there is a very slight possibility of the Supreme Court in Israel modifying this, but I really don't think it's much of a chance. I think that it's great that there are parties inside Israel, or political or human rights entities, that are prepared to contest this piece of legislation that was just voted in on Thursday. But I really don't think that, given the composition of the Supreme Court, that this will be very consequential, or that we can expect too much from the Israeli Supreme Court.
Right. It is Women's Month, and we are doing as best as we can to apply gender lens on some of these international developments and even regionally. So could there be intended or unforeseen collective punishment?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is going to particularly impact on women who are wanting to get partners from Gaza and from the West Bank. And this will further lead to, it's both a gender thing, I mean, as well as for children, because for a number of years now, the marriages between Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, it hasn't been, I mean, okay, fine, marriages and so on were consummated before the ad hoc laws were passed, a number of years ago. And so spouses haven't been able to really develop families. And generally, it is the women who will suffer much more than the men, because in most societies, men find the wherewithal to make do, but women have a much more difficult time in making do with this kind of xenophobic and racist legislation.
Professor Farid Esak, thank you so much for your time and insights. Professor Farid Esak is with the University of Johannesburg and is a board member of Lobby Group Africa for Palestine.